I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, as always, but slimmed down, wartime conditions, social distancing, and all of that. As always, I'm joined by an audience of distinguished experts, and this time, only one enthusiastic amateur, namely me. We'll be discussing the vital question of whether or not there'll be a world by November. Will Donald Trump drag the world into war before his election in November 2020? The short answer for me would be no, not intentionally at least. But therein lies the problem. When the United States is hurtling its hardware around the world, in the Persian Gulf, you can hardly swing a cat and avoid hitting an American warship. When in the South China Sea, just like in the Persian Gulf, the clue is in the name, you know, you've got American warships, yes, but heavy strategic bombers flying over Chinese waters. And when you've got the United States trying a 21st century B-movie rerun of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in the early 1960s, this time in Venezuela, even more farcical, an even bigger fiasco, but masking perhaps in the way that a cloud no bigger than a man's hand can be a harbinger of great storms to come. Actual invasion of Venezuela by the United States of America, then anything can, of course, go wrong. You don't have to be a devotee of the Dr. Strangelove theory of American government to see how an accident even could trigger a real-life hot war in any of these three theaters or others as yet unknown, unnamed. In the Persian Gulf, for example, what if an Iranian gunboat defending its own territory in the Persian Gulf were to fire on an American warship? What if the Americans were to claim falsely that Iran had fired on an American warship, and in a wag the dog pre-election maneuver, Donald Trump were to go in all guns blazing? Iran, of course, is no pushover, as it's already demonstrated. Were Trump to do so, Iran would undoubtedly fight back, and not just against the Americans directly either, but against their allies, giving them succor and comfort and bases and flying and sailing permissions over and alongside their territory. If Venezuela were invaded by the United States, sure, the mass of the Venezuelan people would rise up to meet them. But Venezuela has important friends in the world, and it would be testing their patience, perhaps a bridge too far, to imagine that they would not intervene in the conflict. And of course, the most dangerous one of all, because China doesn't actually need any friends. China is the emerging superpower of all superpowers. China's economy, China's military, China's tremendously united population, with one or two small exceptions, the vast majority of China's population, the biggest in the world, would rally behind their government, their state, in any confrontation with the United States. Now, Trump has already begun the prelude of the steps, essential steps to war with China. He is keeping up a false, lying drumbeat of accusations against China 24/7, all platforms. And of course, his opposition, the Democratic Party, feels that it has no choice but to go along with his anti-China rhetoric, even though they'd prefer to keep up the rhetorical war against Russia. They must come on board. So you have a united front in the American political class against China. You have actual moves to confiscate billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese assets directly, or to renege on debt to China as a so-called retaliatory measure against the false accusation that it was China that unleashed the coronavirus on the world. It may actually not even have come from China in the first place. France, now it transpires, had coronavirus cases last November. But even if it did come from China, of course, that doesn't mean China unleashed it on the world. As a matter of fact, China's done more than any country in the world to warn everyone about the danger of this pandemic. And of course, the economic and trade sanctions are already in place and are being ramped up. Now, some will disagree, but I think Donald Trump does not intend war in any of these theaters. I think it's all theater, albeit theater that's costing many, many lives. But there's many a slip between cup and lip, and anything, literally anything, can go wrong. And if it does, the consequences could be that next year you won't be here, and I won't be here, and we'll all be incinerated in the conflagration that Donald Trump has wittingly or unwittingly unleashed, to coin a phrase. Now, Ahmed Caballo, one of Britain's really up-and-coming journalists and broadcasters, you're quite intimately associated with two of these three potential theaters, in the sense that you lived and worked in Venezuela as a journalist and broadcaster. You know the subject intimately. And you work for Press TV, which is, of course, supported by Iran. So what's your take on whether or not Trump, in all this brinkmanship and all this bluff and bluster, might actually drag us into war?
Well, the escalation with Iran was before the lockdown, although there's been, as you mentioned, something happening in the Persian Gulf. I think most of his energy has been directed towards Venezuela. So there was the 15 million bounty put on Nicolas Maduro and 10 million put on Vladimir Petrino, the head of the military service, the defense minister. And after that, on May the 3rd, we saw this Bay of Piglets, is what it's been dubbed, this real pathetic attempt, which was actually foiled by local fishermen initially. And I think now, although the US has tried to distance itself from those actions, it's tried, Jordan Goudreau, who is in charge of the gun for hire private mercenary organization, Silver Corp USA, it's tried to suggest that he should be investigated for weapons charges. So it's tried to provide a distance between Jordan Goudreau and the US government. However, what Secretary of State Mark Pompeo said recently is that if the two US citizens are not released, then they'll go and get them. So that could be the manner in which a US aggression against Venezuela would play out. And you've got to ask yourself, if the US wasn't involved in this, if they had nothing to do with it, surely they recognize that what the two American ex-Green Berets did was illegal, and therefore any sovereign nation has a right to try them in their own courts and following their own due process. So there's a couple of things there. In regards to China, I feel like, as you've mentioned, this is posturing. I feel like with the Russiagate, which is a complete false allegation, in my opinion, between Trump and Russia, he's tried to now associate Biden with China. And I think as we're getting closer to November election, we'll see more and more rhetoric. It's already every day happening. And I think it understands who it can pick on and who it can't pick on. And China's a dog that it doesn't really want to get into a fight with.
Sure, but when you've got all these warships, and now, as I say, strategic bombers in the South China Sea, that bluffing depends upon China not taking a firm stand. Now, the day will come, when it will come, I'm not in a position to say, but the day will come when China will say, so this far, no further. We're not putting up with this anymore. What if that day comes much sooner than the Americans expect?
I think China's foreign policy is clearly led by very rational, pragmatic leaders. And they understand that whatever happens post-November, even if Trump is re-elected, which many people think he will be, this will de-escalate. And I think if these type of actions were to happen in post-November, in Trump's second term, then China might be forced to react and think, okay, they've gone too far. But I think they have understood this as part of the election game. This isn't the first time this happened. With Romney versus Obama, we saw vicious anti-China rhetoric around that time. It happens in American elections. It's part and parcel of the American political system, where they red bait, they demonize Russia, they demonize China. I think in regards to Venezuela, going back to that case study, I think they've kind of blown it with this opportunity. I think it's clear from an investigation carried out by Canary that the United Kingdom was also involved in this recent attempt. There was a reconstruction unit which wanted to profit, wanted to promote British businesses post-coup, which we can only imagine has something to do with the large oil reserves, the large diamond reserves, the large gold reserves. And I think whatever they did, they've blown it, and there won't be another opportunity to go back in there. It's so close to an election.
Well, because of course it could turn out to be another fiasco. What if the US invade Venezuela to try and free these two prisoners, and that goes belly up, just like the Bay of Piglets went belly up? That would actually be further humiliation for Donald Trump. We'll come back to that. Daniel Cosby from the British Communists. You know China very well. Does Ahmed characterize their foreign policy correctly? In other words, that they'll soak it up, they'll allow any amount of rhetoric, even any amount of sanctions, without making a stand? Or are we reaching maybe more quickly the point where China will stand up and say, we've had enough of this?
I think in terms of rhetoric, China isn't too fussed. It's water off a duck's back to them. They take actions much more seriously than words. They know there's a lot of bluff and bluster coming from the US side of things, and so there's not much reason in paying too much attention to that. What they do pay attention to is their allies and what's going on economically, particularly. Now, the US has obviously been heavily sanctioning Venezuela and many other countries that China is willing to work with, to trade with, to partner and build with, in particularly the Belt and Road Initiative. So after the past 10 years, China has been opening up and developing good relations with a number of countries, some of which the US is sanctioning or seeks to demonize or potentially invade. And I think that's where they're starting to realise that a line has to be drawn when invasion is threatened on these countries which have, committed no international crimes, done nothing wrong, which the US has no reason or jurisdiction to go and invade and try and police. They're much more concerned now on the global stage of protecting their allies and protecting their friends and stopping the US from going on this kind of rampage.
Well, let's take a recent example. The US has promised, not threatened, promised to intervene on bilateral trade between Iran and Venezuela. That presumably means boarding ships, acts of international piracy. Well, it's one thing if they do that against Iran. What if they do it against China?
I don't think they'd be so brazen to do it against China. They have shown that they're willing to mess with Iran, and it's like dipping their toe in the water, really. The same with these mercenaries going into Venezuela. There's all these small acts to dip their toe in the water and test the reaction. I think if they'd gotten away with these mercenaries, which is a complete moonshot, kidnapping Maduro, I don't think that would have had the result they wanted. I think there would have been, a large base of popular support still against the US and any kind of regime change. But all these little actions are testing the water to see what they can get away with. And I think the US is very well aware that they can't get away with that with China. There's been quite a few studies come out recently, commissioned by the US military or certain defense contractors, analysing how well they would fare in different types of warfare or combat with China, and they all fare very badly for the US.
Fascinating. Let's hear from an expert on American affairs. He's written a whole series of books on it. He's my favourite pundit on American studies. He's Professor Inderjeet Parmar, and I hope he joins us now. Professor.
Okay, thank you. My name is Professor Inderjeet Parmar. I'm a visiting professor of international politics at City University of London, and I'm also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. In regard to the question, which is to do with whether or not President Trump would accept any election result in which he was defeated, we remember back to November 2016. Even though he won the election through the Electoral College, he claimed that the election itself was rigged because he lost the popular vote. And ever since then, he's maintained a sort of idea that there's a lot of ballot rigging going on in the United States.
If Trump is defeated, will he accept the result, or will we see more armed men on the streets?
I think he's made a few allusions over the last year or so to having lost a couple of years of his administration to the Robert Mueller inquiry into his Russian collusion and so on. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, remarked in an interview that there were possibilities of the election itself being postponed as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And then the following day, when he was pressed on that question, he said that he rode back a little bit, but he said only that he hadn't heard that there were any discussions going on about postponing the election. So there is an issue here that either the result or the election itself could be postponed, or an attempt could be made to postpone it. I think it would cause a massive constitutional crisis. And as you know, the election is on the 3rd of November 2020, but the new president, or the second term of Trump's presidency, would only commence on the 20th of January 2021. So in that period, there would be a huge constitutional crisis. And if it were to go to the Supreme Court, we know that the Supreme Court has a majority which is conservative and quite heavily pro-Trump. So that would cause a very large amount of trouble. Some of that could well spill out onto armed protest within the United States itself. And we're seeing already in this lockdown, or the anti-lockdown protests, which have broken out in a number of states, in probably about 20 states, and 3 or 4 of them in a very, very serious way. So when you look at Michigan, for example, there have been talk on various Facebook groups that Governor Whitmer should be assassinated or hung or lynched. Armed men broke into the Capitol building itself. Some of them in the gallery. Some of the legislators are having to wear bulletproof vests while debating within the chamber itself. And there are very strong links between the protesters. So, for example, among the organizing committees were the Michigan Conservative Coalition, which is linked with the Trump administration. The wife of the lawmaker who heads that is actually part of the Women for Trump coalition, was a delegate from Michigan for the Republican National Convention in 2016, as was the co-chair of that. the Michigan Republican Party is well represented in these protests too. So what we've got is a very strong linkage between the Trump administration and these various armed and other right-wing groups as well. So it could well be that by 2020, November, you could have these people empowered even more as they gain more and more prominence through the anti-lockdown protests.
Daniel, this is quite surreal, isn't it? That if you told me just 5 years ago that we'd be sitting discussing whether an American president would actually leave office if defeated, if you'd told me that there might be a question of complete abrogation of the elections in the first place, if you told me that armed men with the president's approval would be storming state capitals with automatic weapons, I'd have thought you were slightly premature. Nothing says American decline like all of this, don't you think?
Well, it's all related to the American economy, essentially. And what Trump spoke about during his first election campaign back in 2015, 2016, was restoring American manufacturing, restoring American jobs, all these things that have been lost through the economic decline of America, and essentially because those jobs could be done elsewhere cheaper. It makes no sense for a car manufacturer to keep manufacturing cars if they have to pay someone $25 an hour, when they can move it to a country where they can pay $10 an hour in a largely automated plant. So Trump really resonated with these kind of people, and of course he puts out all the right signals to these libertarian groups who value nothing more than their complete independence and their guns. I don't think the Democrats did themselves any favours either throughout the whole presidency of Donald Trump, trying to frustrate him and sabotage him at every turn, including the impeachment trial, which was a complete waste of time because obviously the Republicans kicked that ball right out of the pitch. So it's no surprise that his drain the swamp, get rid of these elites rhetoric has resonated so well with a disenfranchised American population who have now seen him, frustrated at every turn. Nothing he proposed really would have fixed the decline of America, but people can easily buy into that myth, much like they can buy into the anti-China rhetoric and China being the source of all the woes.
Professor, if Trump does lose, can we expect to see more tension inside the United States, but perhaps more importantly, around the world?
I think this is part of the recklessness and the self-centeredness of President Trump himself, but it could cause a very large amount of public discontent and public unrest among his more belligerent supporters. But I don't think that they have a more kind of an authority which is national. So when you look at the far right and the alt-right, many of whom support the Trump administration, they are relatively few in number. That's not to say they may not organize protests and so on and cause other kinds of disruption. But I think it'd be very, very difficult for President Trump and for those groups to do anything very effective.
Professor Inderjeet, thank you very much indeed for that. Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but asking if the whole world will be dragged into war by Donald Trump before the November election. Sahil Ali, you are an Africa specialist, also an international affairs specialist. This is an area we haven't yet talked about. Africa is actually the scene of one of the most intensive competitions, maybe potentially conflicts between the United States and China. Tell us, give us a picture of that.
Thank you, George. Really, the significance of the continent in the world arena has been increasing day after day. And this is due to the dynamic African young population, also the many African countries, when you look at the United Nations General Assembly, having voting power when it comes to decision making. You have got 194 countries, 54 of them are from Africa. You also have the well-known issue, which is the Africa largely having untapped natural resources. 1 in every 3 countries either has large deposits of oil and gas or other natural resources like gold, diamond, uranium. So Africa has always been in the eyes of the foreigners a ready-made meal somewhere, waiting someone to pick it up. I look from that angle. As you mentioned, clearly the theater of confrontations would be in Africa, as I believe. I give you an example. First of all, the tiny, small but vibrant country of Djibouti. United States and other countries have established military bases there. These military bases provide this poor African country a source of income, and which Djibouti uses to improve its port facilities to have a bigger capacity for the developing African nations. The problem here is that during the Cold Wars, America's influence in Africa was tremendously high. But after the end of the Cold War, America abandoned Africa. The Chinese stepped in. I think when you look at the Chinese coming, many Africans favored the Chinese as their preferred business partner, simply because Chinese are not interested. They don't require democracy, good governance, these conditions which the Western countries put forward before dealing any country about anything. The Chinese are not interested in human rights records. They will straight go into business with countries that they come across to. The problem here is that it has become a room for Americans and others to criticize China. But in reality, the African countries were benefiting the deal. The Chinese-African trade cooperation forums, which call it FOCAC, I believe, it started in 2010. Within 10 years, within 9 years, America was left behind totally. But there are also problems with the Chinese stepping into Africa and doing trade. If you look at an example, Djibouti, 50% of the country's total debt, the ratio of the country's total debt to the gross domestic product was 50%. It was in 2016. Chinese came, started to do business with Djibouti, and that rate has exceeded by the end of 2019, has exceeded 100%. That means the debts Djibouti has mostly came from China, and it is used to invest in different fields to help the economy and also improve the port facilities. But when you look at this, it is clear that the Djibouti cannot pay its debts to China. And this is where Americans are making the news that many countries, like Djibouti, would fall a victim to Chinese debt trap diplomacy. So America, when you look at Djibouti and similar countries, it has lost the prestige. It has got a big base with the 4,000 American soldiers in there, waging wars against the jihadists like Al-Shabaab in nearby Somalia. You have seen every day. There is no day that passes without drones hitting targets inside Somalia, and it's escalating. So these wars are waged from a country which America feels it is losing to China. So it is not and we know all of us that the Americans have tradition of, provoking, instigating wars under manufactured threats.
Yeah, or even falsifying them.
Yeah, we have
even
seen,
if they don't happen,
we
they
have
make
seen
them happen.
we have seen that in Libya. We have seen that in Iraq under the banner of it poses weapons of mass destruction. We have seen in Iran even the killing you mentioned. General Soleimani was an attempt to drag Iran into theater of war. But I believe Americans are sick and tired of this man's tricks, and they will not be lured into wars.
Of course, the Vietnam War was entirely based upon a completely fake Gulf of Tonkin
Yes.
provocation, which it now turns out, accepted by everyone, never actually happened. Fascinating. Let's cross the Atlantic and hear what Caleb Mopan, the celebrated American journalist and broadcaster, has to say on this. I mean, bluntly, Caleb, will Donald Trump drag the world into conflict?
Well, Trump certainly likes theater. He likes the idea of being on TV, portraying himself as a hero, depicting himself like he might be a character in a Hollywood action movie. So if Trump thinks that those optics and theatrics are in his benefit for re-election, he may take such moves. However, I've long stated that there are big divisions among the rulers of the United States at this time. Trump seems to be aligned with a faction that feels they've been left out of the club. Wealthy people that are not among America's elite. You've got Betsy DeVos, right? She's Trump's Secretary of Education. She's one of the wealthiest people in the United States, and she's tied to Eric Prince of Blackwater. That's her brother, and that's a military contracting corporation. Trump is very close to Bernie Marcus, who's the owner of Home Depot, which is a hardware store chain in the United States. It's very tied in with military manufacturers.
People around the world were astonished to see heavily armed men with automatic weapons and with the president's encouragement storming citadels, storming the seats of government in various American states. Is this Trump showing before November that he's prepared to fight if it all goes wrong?
When it comes to selling military hardware around the world, when it comes to military interventions and the use of military contractors, you can see Trump tied to people that benefit from that. However, Trump also, he has a lot of supporters who are non-interventionists. He ran on a platform of not intervening around the world, and he's been critical of the kind of soft power strategy and the globalist approach of previous administrations. He seems to be less interested in head-on long-term confrontations. He was critical of the way Libya and Syria were handled. So it's complicated. Trump's supporters seem to be more isolationist and less interested in confrontations around the world, though Trump has cozied up to groupings that are very hostile to Iran, groupings that are very hostile to Venezuela. But when it comes to long-term geopolitical confrontations, what they call frozen conflicts, with countries aligned with Russia and China, Trump seems less interested. He's less interested in NATO and strengthening the NATO alliance in Europe. So it's complex. We shall see how this plays out.
Would Trump accept a defeat in November were it to happen?
Well, the thing is, wars are very unpopular among the U.S. public right now. The U.S. public overwhelmingly, according to poll after poll after poll, is not interested in new military interventions and a new war. Now, Trump has supporters that are among his coalition that are interested in confronting Venezuela, confronting Iran. But in terms of the general U.S. public, beyond special constituencies and lobbyists, there is not an interest in a war. And if Trump were afraid of possibly not being elected and losing his chances of re-election, I would think that he would probably want to de-escalate. He would probably want to give the impression that he's not getting the United States into more military entanglements and more long-term conflicts. If anything, Trump would try to emphasize his his role as a non-interventionist or an isolationist. His slogan, America First, was the slogan he used in previous elections. It was actually lifted from the America First Committee, which was a group that tried to prevent the USA from getting involved in the Second World War. Trump appeals to paleo-conservatives, people on the right wing, libertarian elements that seem to be less interested in foreign meddling and foreign confrontations.
Is this pandemic working in favor of Donald Trump's re-election or against it?
Well, it seems right now to be working against him. He's been widely accused of mismanaging and mishandling the pandemic. It seems that many of his critics have gotten a lot of attention and a lot of public applause for calling him out for how he's handled the pandemic. However, Trump has pushed this trade war with China. You have Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, who really pushes confrontation with China. And Trump would very much like to blame the pandemic on China and escalate the trade war with China, tensions with China. And if this notion that China is somehow responsible for the pandemic can continue to rise among the public, that can benefit Trump because he's seen as an opponent of China on the international stage. It's very complicated. A lot depends on what happens in the next few months, how the country goes about opening up, and whether or not this anti-China narrative sticks.
Caleb Mopan, thank you very much indeed from the epicenter, actually, in New York City, where so many thousands, tens of thousands of people have died. Ahmed, I suppose what happens in America is their business. If they want their president to prolong his term, or if they don't like it, they can rise up and overthrow him. These are all domestic American political concerns, at least from my point of view. The question for us is, in this absolute turmoil, does it make war more likely? It must do, mustn't it? It's the best possible diversion. Look over there, Johnny Foreigner. Let's unite against him.
I was talking about this off air before we started. I was asked by a Venezuelan taxi driver, so what do you think? Do you think that, this was when I was in Venezuela this time last year, do you think that war's likely? Do you think they'll go after us? And my answer at the time was, the Venezuelan people haven't been demonized the same way the people of Iraq were demonized. The government has been demonized that way, but the people, to wage a full-scale war, you need to dehumanize the people as well as the government. And what I find most interesting, the people most demonized during this whole crisis is the Chinese people. And yet, as you mentioned, they're the strongest. Now, I don't think the ground is fertile for a war with the other two countries because they have nothing against Venezuelan people. Venezuelan people have done nothing to them. Iran is that ship has sailed with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, where it came to the verge and it seemed like the American public weren't up for it. And now with China, they have been demonized. Trump even recently demonized a Chinese American journalist when she answered the question. But China's simply too strong. And also, the financial people around Trump understand that the markets, the Chinese markets and the American markets are intertwined, and nothing will guarantee you losing an election more so than the economy completely crashing. And the economy is already on the verge of crashing anyway because of COVID-19, but a war with China would send it completely under.
The Chinese stock market, Sahel, is booming, as ours are tanking. Foreign capital. In London, people are not buying shares in the London stock market, they're buying them in Beijing. China has just bought, last weeks, 250,000 tons of American soybean. It's due to buy under the terms of the trade agreement, one part of which was concluded, second part probably never will be. But the part that was concluded requires China to buy several $100 billion worth of American goods and services. So are you with Ahmed in this, in closing down the possibility of an American-Chinese war? And that presumably means we need to look elsewhere. If there's going to be a war and it isn't against China, well, on terms of Russian roulette, that only leaves two.
I think wars have become means of making money, businesses for some countries. So a world without war is just like a world without
Egg
people.
without salt.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. I agree with my colleague that they will not venture into taking war to China. They may look for a war, not with Russia or China, but they will create and start kind of Cold War with China. Cold War with China, and they may pressure these Middle Eastern and African countries who are doing businesses with China. So the Chinese are in a difficult position. You are doing trade with countries that you are not militarily protecting them. So the Chinese, in this case, they are just setting up, they may build roads, schools, hospitals, but the question, if Americans can easily make regime changes by either arming groups against one another, as they have historically done in many areas, will the Chinese be able to do the opposite and prevent these countries from falling? This is a big question. So what the Chinese need, they need to have a military presence in the continent. You cannot simply succeed with your own businesses and trade you're doing with Africa while you do not have a military foot there.
This is a paradox, isn't it, Daniel, that China will eventually have to face. It's all very well saying that you have a policy against hegemony, a policy against interfering in other people's countries. The problem is your rival is interfering in other people's countries, and your rival is interested in hegemony. So what happens, in Sahel's example, China is investing huge amounts in, say, an African country, has transformed its infrastructure and roads and so on, and the Americans regime change that country, and the debts to China are reneged upon.
Yes.
The investment is lost. What happens then?
Well, I think China is quite prepared to accept some losses in the course of what they're building. They have actually written off the debts of many nations that can't pay them. But we have to face the fact that a cornered animal is most dangerous, and the USA is certainly cornered at the moment. You know, with the economy tanking, they don't really have much other option than war. War is one tried and tested solution to fix one of these periodic crises, the global recession we're going through. It funnels all the economic energy and effort into a national base of construction development, albeit of war weapons, which is then used to destroy massive amounts of wealth and resources across the world. So that's always a threat that the US may be willing to turn to war to solve its crisis of overproduction. And I think China has to be well aware of it, and is well aware of it, that it's a very dangerous game that the US is playing. So I think China is cautious but well aware of what's going on.
Well, we're not able to do our usual vox popping with the Kalima Horra camera on the streets of London, so we asked the public to send us their videos of how they see this question. Let's take a look.
Personally, I don't believe that Trump will be the one to initiate the war with Iran and the future wars that may follow after it. I take that belief because of what happened in Syria, whereas Syria, the Hillary camp was very pro no-fly zone and very, very keen on intervention, whereas the Trump administration, although it portrayed that in the media that they wanted to be very pro-intervention, and they did do a couple of strikes on the Syrian mainland, but they didn't actually go ahead with a no-fly zone kind of thing. And if we look at it in terms of geopolitics and what's going on in the region, if anything, they kind of left Syria alone in a way. And with the troops pulling out as well, the US troops pulling out of Syria for the most part. In terms of the outcome long term, with the upcoming US election, the Democrats are rather desperate to get rid of Donald Trump, and They're trying every game in the book to do it ever since he got elected.
Invoking a new war in order to postpone the elections seems like a rather drastic measure. Donald J. Trump, for all his fiery rhetoric, is nevertheless far from a warmonger if we are to compare his track record to that of his predecessors. Most important of all, economy-wise, he has done fairly well. GDP may not be much to look at, but nevertheless, it had been experiencing steady growth until the recent pandemic, at least, and there hadn't been any sudden plunges as under Obama's administration. The foreign direct investment in the US is the highest that it's been in recent history as well. And the corporate income tax was reduced a couple of years ago under Trump's administration by 14%. Hence, the American business community should be fairly happy with Trump. In terms of the general public, looking at the wages and salaries statistics, there has been steady growth. Employment is the highest and unemployment lowest that it has been in a decade. Consumer spending is highest that it has been in a decade as well. So if, let's say, well, 4 years ago, a lot of people were not willing to gamble their vote away for a dark horse, such as Trump, he has now come to prove himself, and he's more likely now to win the popular vote than he did 4 years ago. As far as the Electoral College vote is concerned, Republicans seem to have the upper hand over the Democrats in the Congress at the moment. Also, Trump has surely come to make some new influential friends over the past 4 years. So most likely he has that should be going for him as well. So all he needs to do now is take the country out of the pandemic and score these extra points and make himself known as the winner or the victor or whatever he decides to call himself once the US is out of the pandemic, and then he should be able to win the elections without invoking a new war.
Well, that young man must be a member of Donald Trump's family. He may be a son-in-law that we just haven't been introduced to yet. Because, of course, American unemployment is now almost 30%, a higher percentage, several percent higher than it was in the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the American economy will be very lucky indeed if it even stops falling before November's general election. Only time for a quick roundup from my three distinguished guests in the studio. Sahil, you first. In a few sentences, will Trump drag us into war? And perhaps an addendum. If Trump is defeated in November, will the Democrats drag us into a new war?
I think a direct confrontation, military war, the kind the world used to see, would not be an option for the United States. What Trump would be doing, definitely, they would try to limit the Chinese sphere of influence. Where they can end it altogether, they would do it. And the Chinese would not easily be a target for this. They will try to come up with a solution. So these kind of semi-cold wars would be a characteristic for the coming years in Africa and elsewhere.
Ahmed, who would want to be a proxy for this boxer that's almost out and whose popularity and soft power in the world was so miserable?
I don't know. Who would want to follow a guy that advises the public to drink bleach? It doesn't, I don't imagine there'd be many kind of volunteers jumping to the front of the queue. But then again, you asked about the Democrats. Who would want to follow a guy that looks like he's half asleep and has to get his wife to speak on his behalf, and that's sleepy Joe Biden? Either end, it doesn't look too good for American soft power at the moment or American soft power in the future?
Exactly. Daniel, last word to you. Nothing says American decline like Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, surely.
I mean, it points to the fact that in some senses these people are irrelevant. Donald Trump's certainly shaken things up. He's caused a lot of fuss, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be him deciding whether America goes to war or not. It's going to be the actual factors of the American economy in decline, the global economy in recession. And people do try and convince themselves of all kinds of reasons why we couldn't have a big war. But just before World War I and World War II, everyone was still trading with Germany and Italy and the Axis. Trade was still going on. Life looks relatively normal. Neville Chamberlain famously, came back the year before saying peace in our lifetimes. These things can break out, and they break out because of the economic factors. So I think that's something we have to be very aware of. And the criticism of China for trading on the basis globally of a free market is very rich, coming from countries like America, who have insisted they do it with arms. Any country that tries to build itself according to socialist principles is sanctioned and or invaded by the United States. So,
in the name of the free market.
Of course, it has to be free. It must be. Freedom or your life back. And China's beating them at their own game, and they're very unhappy about that.
Fantastic. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. I've been George Galloway. My distinguished guests and those that we connected with online have brought you another Kalima Horra. I hope you enjoyed it.